Hi everyone, and welcome to our fifth night of storytelling, 5 of 14 nights. Welcome back if you've been following these stories already, and if this is your first time, then welcome. We are being followed by campers, by people who'll be new to camp this summer, by their families, also by people who have been on my writing retreats, by people who take classes at Centauri Arts, friends, family, and also people I've taught in schools, colleges, and so on in Ontario, and adults I've taught through the Life Institute and various other different places. So welcome to all of you, and this is our fifth night. If you have missed any of the other stories, they are all still live, so you can go back and listen to them at any time you would like to. So why are we doing this? Well, stories have been linking people together for thousands of years, and I think more than anything, we all need that connection right now, when so many other means of connection are close to us. Any way we can take to connect with one another really matters. So that's really why I'm doing this, because it's the one thing I think I can do to help people connect. I just want to say a couple of words before we get started tonight about how I choose stories. Firstly, every story that I tell, I try and choose things where I have a personal connection to the culture. So that's why most of my stories are Celtic or Chinese, because those are the cultures that I have a connection to. The other stories that I tell are ones that are already generally out there, being disseminated through a variety of different cultures, that have been told in many different ways and given many different meanings by different cultures over the years. And one example would be Greek myths, maybe another would be the Arabian Nights, those kind of stories where we're all connected to them in some way and we can all relate to them in some way. So I'll often tell those. And thirdly, I'll tell stories if people ask me to, and if I feel I can do a good job, and if I feel that I understand the story. Generally, if people ask me to tell stories, I stay really true to the story. Whereas if these are sort of Celtic stories, traditional folk stories, that sort of thing, I'll do a little bit of an interpretation on them, the way all storytellers do. And then finally, one of the issues I think with traditional stories is that often they have traditional values that maybe we don't identify with so much today. So, for example, it's the male characters that are the most dominant, and the female ones that always need saving, that sort of thing. And I try to, although some of my stories do have that structure because traditional stories have that, and we just have to accept it, I do try to steer towards stories with very strong female characters, even if they may not be the central character. And there's always ways of approaching stories that look at the strengths that are there within the characters anyway. And it's always interesting to look at how you can bring those out as a storyteller. So that's just a little bit about the stories that I'm telling. I do acknowledge that sometimes gender roles have changed, and I do what I can to reflect that. But I think sometimes we just have to accept with traditional stories that the gender roles may not be what they are today. So I'm about to start now. So what I would like to do is ask you all to get comfortable, to grab your favorite pillow, blanket, to put yourself in a position where you feel comfortable, and maybe to grab your favorite snack or drink. This story is maybe slightly longer than the others so far. This tale is actually one that I found a few years ago when I was at the bookshop in Stratford, England, the bookshop run by the Royal Shakespeare Company, and they have a whole, tens of thousands of books, all connected to Shakespeare somehow. And this was a book of folk stories that Shakespeare was inspired by. And so I think you'll guess pretty early on in the story which play of Shakespeare's took its inspiration from this folk story, as obviously many others as well. But this was one of the stories that Shakespeare was perhaps very aware of when he was writing. So I might also tell a story tomorrow night, which also uses a traditional story inspired by Shakespeare. So please remember, I'm telling stories, I'm not reading them, so it will not be totally fluid, but that is part of, hopefully, the experience. And again, try to picture yourself in a room filled with people. That's what we do at camp. We have a large theatre filled with people, soft music, soft lighting, and everyone with their eyes closed sharing an experience. So that's what that is. This is really, if you're listening to this at the time it goes live, you are sharing this with other people. So just bear that in mind and enjoy. So this is the story of Ashboy. Once upon a time, a long time ago, there was a kingdom ruled by two brothers. And the names of those brothers were Hovindel and Feng. And Hovindel, because he was the elder brother, was the one who officially ruled the kingdom. But they'd always been friends, and they shared the role to some extent. And all was fine and all was harmonious, until Hovindel met a woman called Gertrude and fell in love with her. Because Feng was also secretly in love with Gertrude, and now it began to seem to him that his brother had everything he should want and everything that he deserved. Hovindel was king of the entire country, and now he also had Gertrude. And what did Feng have? Feng would stand to the side and see the woman that he loved with somebody else, and the kingdom that he wanted to rule being commanded by his elder brother. So over time there was something that darkened inside Feng's soul and just made him feel envious for everything his brother had. And that only got worse when Hovindel and Gertrude became parents, and they brought into the world a boy who would one day inherit the kingdom that Feng so wanted and so desired. But this child was not like other children. This boy was not like princes who came before him. As he grew, he didn't desire to fight. He didn't learn to ride a horse. He didn't learn to wield a sword. He wasn't interested in being boisterous and loud with others. He wasn't interested, it seemed, in leading. He had none of the qualities that seemed to indicate a good prince and a future leader of the kingdom. Instead, this boy would sit by the fire day after day after day, staring into the flames until the flames worked their way down to ash. And some people thought that this was a sign of great wisdom, that this child was learning to think, and that a kingdom required thinkers more than anything. But others, chief among them Feng, started to tease the child and to declare that he was a fool, that he would not be worthy of running a kingdom at all. And so in time, this child grew a nickname, and that nickname was Ashboy, because of his time spent staring into the flames and how the flames worked their way down to ash, and still he would just be staring into the fire. And so soon everybody in the kingdom called the child Ashboy, a trend that was encouraged by Feng, and everyone laughed at his expense, and everyone whispered secretly that Ashboy really was no future king, and that maybe Feng should rule the kingdom one day. And Ashboy grew seemingly unconcerned by all of this, and stared at the flames each night until they worked their way down to ash, and just thought deep thoughts. And even his mother started to suspect that there was something wrong with him. And Feng grew in power, and Feng grew in influence, and Feng was poisoned to his deepest, darkest corners of his soul, until one day Feng and Hovindel and Gertrude went out hunting together. And while they were hunting, something terrible happened. And when he returned, seemingly distraught and upset, this is how Feng reported on what had happened that day in the forest. He said that while he and his brother and Gertrude were riding through the forest, a deep, dark fog descended, as if it contained evil within it. And the fog descended until no one could see anything. And then Feng, standing in this dark fog, heard what he thought was Gertrude screaming. And he rushed forward to her rescue, his sword drawn, and saw what he thought was a great monster emerging from the fog towards Gertrude. And as the fog descended darker and darker, the monster, just a shape now, lunged towards Gertrude, and Feng, in just a split second, made a decision, and he raced forward and plunged his sword into the monster's heart. and then the fog rose, and Feng found himself standing over the dead body of his elder brother. And Feng and Gertrude rode in great state through the forest back to the castle with the body of Horvindel between them. And both of them seemed so distraught, so upset, and there was the expected state funeral, and Ashboy, all but forgotten, stood and watched as his father was buried. His father being the only person left in the world who believed in him and who saw the qualities he possessed. And with time, Feng and Gertrude were married. And if anybody had thought this horrific, it now just seemed natural that a queen who had been much loved should now marry the new king. And Feng and Gertrude exercised their power over the kingdom, and everybody's hatred towards Ashboy grew. They looked at him and hoped that Feng and Gertrude would have another son or daughter to rule the kingdom when they were gone, because who was Ashboy? He was just this fool who sat by the fire staring into the flames. But deep down, there was more to Ashboy than met anyone's eye, and he now realized that the only way he was going to survive is if he bode his time, if he waited carefully to see what would happen next. Because if he moved swiftly now, all the great power of his uncle would come down upon him. And in time, Ashboy was sent to the kitchens where nobody needed to see him. And he decided that he would play the fool to protect himself. And he created a veneer of foolishness and spoke gibberish all day, and drooled and stared into the flames, and appeared to be the fool that everyone thought he was. And inside, he waited, and he waited, and he watched his uncle to look for any sign of weakness, and he watched his mother for any sign of the love she had once felt for him. And he sat by the fire in the kitchen until the flames burned down to ash day after day. And he waited. And then, after a few years had passed, when Ashboy was a young man, a princess from a faraway kingdom came calling. Her name was Princess Lavia, and she was sent as an envoy from her father, the king, to try to build closer relationships with Feng and Gertrude's kingdom. And she was met with great feasts and lavish entertainments, for everyone in Feng's kingdom hoped for a deeper connection with hers. And the Princess Lavia was not only powerful and beautiful, she was also wise, and she was intelligent, and she was a great commander, and she was a great envoy for her father and a wonderful diplomat. And she sat alongside Feng and Gertrude and spoke of the connections that she wished to make between them and her father's kingdom, and they admired her greatly. If only we had a son that we could propose in marriage to the Princess Lavia, Feng said to Gertrude. But so far there had been no son to bless the two of them. And as the days went on and the celebrations grew more lavish, servants were in short supply, and so one day Ashboy was sent with a platter of cakes into the banqueting hall where Feng and Gertrude and Princess Lavia sat and chatted. And he walked in with his cakes, and at that point in time, Feng let down his guard a little and decided to crack a joke. And he looked at Ashboy in his kitchen rags, and he shouted, "Look at him, thinking he is good enough to serve the Princess Lavia. Could anybody imagine anything more ridiculous than a creature like that marrying this princess?" And everyone laughed. And Ashboy lifted his head, and he said, "But sir, I could not marry the Princess Lavia anyway. I do not have a brother. If I was murdered, who would marry my wife?" And in the entire banqueting hall, there was suddenly silence. And Feng realized that Ashboy suspected him of murdering his father. And Feng realized that Ashboy was not the fool he took him to be. And Ashboy returned to the kitchen, wondering if he'd signed his own death warrant, or if he'd actually said something wise that perhaps made other people in the kingdom wonder at Feng's innocence, at the story Feng had told everybody of what had happened in the forest that day. And all that night, Feng lay awake plotting, for now he realized Ashboy was a huge danger to him and to his security as king. And the next morning he called Ashboy to him, and he said, "Son, you must forgive me for marrying your mother. You must forgive me for not being able to save your father's life in the forest. You must forgive me for everything." And Ashboy looked at Feng and wondered if his uncle had spent that evening regretting, and if he was being genuine. And Feng said, "Ashboy, I will name you as my heir if you perform a simple task for me." "What is that task?" said Ashboy, so wanting to believe that his uncle still held some goodness. "What I would like you to do," said Feng, "is I would like you to escort the Princess Lavia back to her father's kingdom. I will give you a letter to give to the king, and should you succeed at this, when you return home, I will name you as my heir." "Oh," said Ashboy, "well, that's great, but I'm totally willing to do this, but what does the letter say?" "The letter," said Feng, "the letter says that I advise that Princess Lavia's father should send both you and her on a quest, and that if the two of you succeed in the quest, and when you have had many adventures together, that you should be permitted to have her hand in marriage, and that you and the Princess Lavia will rule over my kingdom and over theirs for all eternity." "Well," thought Ashboy, "maybe my uncle has had a change of heart. Maybe he's not as evil as I thought him to be." And so he bowed low before Feng and said yes, he agreed. He would escort Princess Lavia back to her kingdom, and he would deliver the letter that was being given to him to her father. So Ashboy set out the next day. He set out wearing new clothes, and he set out with the Princess Lavia, and they set out by ship for her father's kingdom. And at first the Princess Lavia was filled with scorn for this so-called kitchen boy, who was suddenly her escort when she felt she needed none. "I am strong enough and I am brave enough to travel these seas by myself," she complained. "I don't need an escort, certainly not a simple kitchen boy who thinks he is a prince." But as days went on and the two of them were at sea together, things began to change. She started to realize that this was no simple kitchen boy that she was at sea with, that there was something very special about Ashboy. He started to tell her stories. He started to impart words of wisdom that he had heard and that he had developed from his years of staring into the flames until they burned down to simple ash. And as days passed into weeks and they sailed across the sea, the two of them fell in love. The Princess Lavia realized that Ashboy had a very deep and wise soul, and that soul was only just beginning to show itself to the world. And Ashboy began to realize that Princess Lavia was wise herself, wise and strong and courageous, and the two of them spent their days together, falling deeper and deeper in love. Until one night, Ashboy went to bed early, and the Princess Lavia started to wonder at the letter that he carried always within his jacket. She started to recall Feng and how she'd never quite trusted him during their nights of dancing in the banqueting hall, and she wondered what Feng had really said to her father in that letter. So while Ashboy was sleeping, she crept into his cabin. She put her hand in his jacket and brought out the letter. She broke the seal and she read it. The letter was very short. All it said was, "Please kill the bearer of this letter." The Princess Lavia was horrified. Not knowing what to do right there and then, she sealed the letter again and placed it back in Ashboy's jacket. Then she returned to her own cabin and spent the night wide awake, wondering what it was she should do. But before dawn, something terrible happened that changed everybody's plans. Before dawn, a storm began. And at first it was a simple, small storm that everyone has at sea. But then it grew wilder and more enraged until it was like a sea creature battering at the small ship. And it battered day and night, until there was nothing the ship could do to fight against it, until the sails were torn to tatters and the mast smashed in two, and then with a great and gigantic crack, the sea smashed down the middle and the waves engulfed it. And the Princess Lavia and Ashboy rushed onto the deck and at the very last minute grabbed hold of each other's hands and leapt into the ocean. And they took hold of a little piece of bark that they found floating, and they paddled towards the distant shore, hoping that they would survive, not knowing what had happened to the others on board the ship. And all day and all night they sat aboard their plank as it sailed the seas, and they pushed and pushed with all their might towards the distant shore. And then the storm abated, and the two of them were washed ashore on a deserted beach. And the Princess Lavia stood up and looked down at Ashboy, who was still alive, but shaking and unconscious on the sand. And she knew that he was deathly ill, and she knew she had to find help. But she herself was weak, too weak to pull his body further up the beach. And when she heard voices, and she heard somebody walking down the sands, all she could think of to do was to hide behind a rock. And as she hid behind the rock, she saw a band of pirates, ugly and fierce, emerging from the far side of the beach and walking towards Ashboy along the sands. And they were laughing and joking and singing. But when they saw the body of the boy, they stopped and leaned over him. And the captain of the pirates looked at the boy and found his pulse and realized he was still alive. "Bring him to our cave," he shouted. And the other pirates did so, and all the pirates wandered across the beach with the body of Ashboy slung over their shoulders and went into the cave that they used as their headquarters, the place they kept their gold and silver and jewels. And all the Princess Lavia could do was to follow behind and to hide and to listen and watch. "Search his pockets for gold," shouted one of the pirates, and Ashboy's pockets were searched. And it was then that they found the letter that he was to deliver to Princess Lavia's father. "Bring him broth," shouted the captain of the pirates, who had once been a great lord, but had fallen foul of the law. And they brought broth, and they fed it into Ashboy's mouth, and Ashboy stopped shivering, and they brought him warm clothes, and gradually and slowly he came back to himself. It was a long illness, and during the time that Ashboy was recovering, the Princess Lavia hunted for food and kept an eye through the bushes, never quite sure if it was safe to let the pirates know that she was there, always fearing that pirates, no matter how good they may seem, can be unpredictable and potentially evil. So she decided that while they healed Ashboy and nursed him back to health, it was better for her to remain alone in the forest and take care of herself. She fashioned weapons just in case she needed them against the pirates or to rescue Ashboy. And she hunted, and she found wild herbs to eat. And she built fires, but built them slowly and quietly deep in the forest so that the pirates would not see. And more often than not, she let the flames of the fire burn down to ashes and stared into the ashes, trying to decide what she should do. And all this time, Ashboy was getting stronger. And on the day that he was fully healed, he was asleep when one of the pirates broke the seal on the letter. They'd grown quite fond of this boy, who had fought against the odds to keep alive, and who clearly came from a land far away, and clearly was not like other boys. And so they broke the seal on the letter and they read it. And when they realized that it said, "Please kill the bearer of this letter," the pirates decided they had to do something. And while the Princess Lavia watched from the bushes, the captain of the pirates wrote a different letter instead, using the royal hand that he had once had, shaping his letters so that they might look like fangs. "I beg you," he wrote in his new letter, "allow the bearer of this note to be married to your daughter." And then, laughing, the pirates replaced the letter in the envelope, and they forged Feng's seal, and they placed the envelope in the pocket of Ashboy's jacket while he slept. And then the pirates decided their job was done, and laughing and singing merrily, they left Ashboy where he was while he slept, and they walked down to the beach, and they took the ship, and they set sail to do more piratey things in other parts of the world. And Ashboy awoke to find the Princess Lavia by his side. And she knew that not only was Ashboy now healed, and she had managed to survive herself, but that the problem of the letter had been solved for them. She said nothing about it to Ashboy, but instead the two of them walked along the beach and over the cliffs day after day, and she taught him how to fend for himself in the forest, how to fashion weapons, and how to hunt, until one day they came to a village where they were able to barter what little they had for a ship, and the ship sailed the two of them across the seas to the Princess Lavia's father's kingdom. And finally, after all their adventures, the Princess Lavia was home. She presented Ashboy to her father, and Ashboy pulled out the letter and handed it to the king. "Well, well, well," he said, looking at Ashboy, who was now dressed in clothing provided for him by the pirates, great and rich clothing befitting a prince. "It looks like you are once again in your uncle's favour," said the king, who'd heard all the stories from Ashboy's kingdom. "And it seems my daughter loves you as much as you appear to love her. Therefore, I give my approval. The two of you may be married, and Ashboy, one day you will be king of this whole land, and my daughter will be queen alongside you, and I'm sure the two of you will rule with great wisdom and great strength." The Princess Lavia and Ashboy embraced, and it was only later, when they were alone, that they shared the secrets they had held for so long. The Princess Lavia, who was quite sad to do so because Ashboy now seemed to trust his uncle again, the Princess Lavia told Ashboy what the contents of Feng's letter had really been. "I thought my uncle was a good person deep down," Ashboy said. "I was ready to forgive him, but all along his letter was commanding your father to have me murdered." The Princess Lavia nodded sadly. "The pirates replaced the note," she said. "I saw them do it, otherwise I would have done so myself, or perhaps we would have run away together and had the adventures we so want to have." "And now," said Ashboy, "there are truths you must know. For I am fairly sure that my uncle killed my father in the forest that day. I'm fairly sure that my father Horvindel, King Horvindel, was killed by Feng, so that Feng could inherit the kingdom and marry my mother." "Well, this is terrible," said the Princess Lavia. "We must tell my father, for if in that case Feng is a pretender, and he must be defeated." And the two of them rushed back to Princess Lavia's father and told him the truths that they now knew. And he said, "We must raise a great navy, a great armada, and we must sail on Feng's kingdom, and we must defeat him. For Ashboy, that kingdom is not Feng's, it belongs to you." And Ashboy realized with a great joy in his heart that this was the moment he'd waited for all his life, all those many years staring into the flames, watching as they worked their way down to ash, thinking and dreaming and growing wiser. All of it had worked it to this moment, the moment when he needed to show his wisdom and his strength and his courage and gain back what was rightly his. And the Princess Lavia and Ashboy trained for many a week, while a giant armada was raised. And to everyone's surprise, that armada was strengthened in numbers by a pirate kingdom that appeared out of the mist one day, many ships led by a great pirate king, and they declared that they would fight alongside the Princess Lavia and Prince Ashboy as they sailed across and challenged Feng. And the day finally came, and a great battle took place. A battle that was brought across the shores to Feng and Gertrude's kingdom, a battle that took place first at sea and then on land. And Feng and Gertrude were defeated. And Ashboy was named king of the very kingdom that he'd been born into. And now Prince Ashboy and the Princess Lavia were together the most powerful couple in the known lands. And along the way, Feng disappeared and was considered banished or dead. And Gertrude was brought before her son. "I don't know what to do," Ashboy said. "You committed great evils against me and against my father, and yet you are my mother. I do not know what to do." Gertrude bowed before her son, begged his forgiveness, and announced that along the way she'd fallen in love with a pirate king, and if he would permit her, she would disappear forever with that king into the mists, and he would never see her again. Under the circumstances, Ashboy considered that this would be the best, both for him and for his mother. And Gertrude and the pirate band disappeared that day. That night, Ashboy and the Princess Lavia discussed what it was they should do next. "I'm not ready to rule," Princess Lavia said, "and my father, the king, is still alive and can rule both kingdoms in our place." "I'm not ready to rule either," said Ashboy. "I have my wisdom, but I am yet to fully test my courage. So let us find a quest. Let us go together beyond the known lands, and let us explore, and let us celebrate the size and the vastness of the universe. And only when we've had many adventures, let's come back and claim the kingdoms that we will rule for the rest of our lives." And Lavia agreed, and it was decided that the very next day the two of them would set sail together into the unknown for whatever adventures may face them. "But there's one thing I have to do first," said Ashboy. "I cannot be Prince Ashboy all my life, for now I'm the only one who remembers the name that my father gave me when I was born. I need to return to that name, and we need to declare that name to all the kingdoms, so that I'm no longer Ashboy. I'm no longer a joke that my uncle decided I would be. I'm the son my father believed in." "And what's your name?" asked the Princess Lavia, as they stood together watching the sunset on the world, waiting for the next sun to rise on their future. And Ashboy looked at her and said, "I will tell you my name, and then tomorrow we set sail together for great adventures." And he smiled and said, "My name is Hamlet." Thank you all for listening, and tomorrow night I'm going to tell another tale that inspired Shakespeare, and maybe this one might be a little bit harder to guess. Thank you all, have a great night, stay safe, and I'll see you tomorrow.